Please tell me you didn't invite him, a guest whispered sharply as the bride dashed down the aisle to embrace an older man who had just stepped into the grand hall. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, turning their heads as if the man's presence somehow cheapened the elegance of the ceremony. But just minutes later, a group of 12 uniformed conductors and railway staff entered the hall in perfect formation, lining up in silent tribute, tipping their caps in unison toward the bride. Isabella Carter began every morning at 5:00 a.m. stepping off the subway at Grand Central Terminal long before the commuter crowds arrived. At 29, she had already worked her way up as a legal associate at a prestigious Manhattan firm. But what her colleagues never knew was that she started each day not in the courtroom, but in the lower-level dining concourse where a small hidden coffee stand opened its shutters just as the city stirred awake. Each morning, Isabella bought 2 black coffees and a plain bagel. One was for herself. The other she left on the far end of Platform 27 next to a rusted bench where a silent old janitor with silver hair and worn-out shoes waited quietly. He never begged, never spoke unless greeted first. For 5 years, Isabella had never learned his name, and he had never offered it. Her coworkers at the firm liked to joke that she had a savior complex. She's wasting good money, they'd laugh. Watch one day he'll scam her for more, they'd whisper. 3 months earlier, the building's new property manager had pulled her aside after overhearing one of these remarks. "It's kind of you," he'd started carefully, "but some tenants have mentioned feeling uneasy. Maybe donate to a registered charity instead." Isabella smiled politely, said she'd think about it, but changed nothing. Instead, she simply began arriving 15 minutes earlier, slipping the bagel and coffee onto the bench before anyone else noticed. She thought she'd gone unseen until last week when an intern at her firm spotted her coming back from the platform. "She's been feeding that old ghost on 27 for years," the intern whispered loudly to a client in the lobby just within earshot. The client had chuckled, shaking their head with mock sympathy. "Poor girl, thinking she's doing something that matters," Isabella had pretended not to hear, quietly returning to her desk like every other day. But deep down, the words stung not because she cared about their opinions, but because they couldn't seem to see what she saw. A human being, not a ghost, not a burden. Her mother had once called her too tender-hearted when Isabella announced her engagement to Ethan Ward, a firefighter who, like her, carried his own quiet rituals of kindness, buying groceries for neighbors, fixing strangers' broken bikes without being asked. "You always pick up strays," her mother had warned. "You give too much away." But Isabella understood something many others didn't. Kindness isn't for recognition. It's for the people the world forgets. She had never actually held a real conversation with the old janitor. Their only exchanges were slight nods, fleeting glances, brief moments of unspoken acknowledgement. But one cold December morning, she noticed him trembling in his thin coat beneath the flickering platform lights. Without hesitation, she took off her scarf, her favorite gray wool scarf, and placed it beside his breakfast. The next morning, the usual bagel and coffee were joined by something new, a napkin scribbled with shaky handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else does." She folded the napkin carefully and kept it in her wallet, pulling it out on particularly harsh days, when the world felt too big, too cold, too indifferent. As her wedding day approached, Isabella, without hesitation, sent invitations to everyone from her office and even joked with Ethan about inviting the entire train station staff. He had only smiled, loving her all the more for her boundless heart. But 2 days before the ceremony, an unmarked envelope arrived at the reception venue. There was no return address, only her name on the front in small, neat handwriting. Inside, a single card read, "Tomorrow I will come not for a favor, but to settle a promise." The envelope had been addressed simply to the bride. Isabella Carter, inside a plain white card, carried neat, almost old-fashioned handwriting offering brief well wishes, and a single line that made the wedding planner pause in confusion as she read it aloud. "Tomorrow I will come not for celebration, but to keep my promise." There was no signature, no sender's name, no return address. Isabella had turned the card over in her hands, wondering if it was from a distant cousin or perhaps one of Ethan's firefighter buddies trying to surprise them. Yet something about the handwriting stirred a strange sense of familiarity, a whisper from the past she couldn't quite place. The morning of her wedding arrived in a blur of laughter, final touches, and nervous excitement. Isabella stood in the bridal lounge overlooking the Grand Hall of Vanderbilt Hall, the centerpiece of Grand Central Terminal, which Ethan had managed to reserve for their special day. Through the towering glass windows, she watched as guests filtered in, family, friends, colleagues dressed in their finest. The chandeliers glowed above the polished marble floor, and the iconic celestial ceiling arched protectively over the gathering. And then, She saw him, standing near the far entrance by the 42nd Street archway, shifting his weight as if unsure whether to step inside, was the old janitor from Platform 27, but this time he wasn't wearing his faded work uniform. He wore a suit old threadbare in places but carefully pressed. His shoes, though scuffed, had been polished. His silver hair, once always hidden beneath a work cap, was combed neatly back. For the first time, Isabella truly saw his face worn by years of hardship but unmistakably dignified. Guests began to notice him too. Isabella heard the whispers ripple through the hall, even from behind the partly open lounge door. "Who let that old station cleaner in? Don't tell me she invited him to her wedding. What's he doing here, looking for free food or charity?" The words felt like cold knives. Without thinking, without caring about the carefully rehearsed ceremony, the waiting photographers, or the flustered planner frantically motioning for her to stay in place, Isabella gathered her flowing white dress in her arms and rushed out of the bridal lounge. She crossed the hall in a blur of white silk, ignoring the gasps and disapproving stares. And when she reached him, she didn't hesitate. She wrapped him in a tight, trembling embrace, tears already threatening to ruin the makeup she had spent hours perfecting. "I never forgot your eyes. The first time I saw you in 2018, she whispered softly. The man drew back slightly, offering a smile so pure and warm it softened every line on his weathered face. "And I remember every single morning you treated me like a human being," he replied, his voice steady and stronger than she'd ever imagined. Isabella linked her arm through his, turning toward the gathering of guests who had fallen silent, unsure of what they were witnessing. The wedding planner, breathless and confused, rushed toward them. "Isabella, we're ready to begin. But who is this gentleman?" Before Isabella could form a single word, the sharp sound of engines revving outside the terminal's main entrance drew everyone's attention. The massive bronze doors of Vanderbilt Hall swung open with mechanical precision, as if the very building itself held its breath. If you've ever misjudged someone type, I was wrong. A hush fell over the crowd as 12 uniformed railway conductors and engineers entered in perfect step, their navy blue coats, crisp brass buttons gleaming under the chandeliers, white gloves folded over their chests with reverence. Their black shoes echoed against the marble floor as they formed two flawless lines stretching from the entrance all the way to the front of the hall. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Someone near the bar dropped a champagne glass, the sharp crack of shattering glass filling the stillness. The lead conductor, a tall man with the nameplate McAllister, stepped forward, stopping precisely before Isabella. He snapped his hand to his cap in a solemn salute. "On behalf of the New York Transit Brotherhood," he announced, his voice steady and loud enough to reach the far corners of the hall, "we are here to honor the woman who quietly, without recognition, sustained one of our own for 5 long years." Gasps and hushed murmurs rippled through the crowd. Isabella stood frozen, clutching the old janitor's arm, her heart pounding. Conductor McAllister turned to face the man by Isabella's side, raising his voice once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Mr. Franklin Aldridge, former chief engineer of Grand Central Terminal, and the man who saved this station from demolition back in 1999. The air seemed to vanish from the room. People who had whispered behind cupped hands only minutes earlier now stood stunned, their mouths agape, eyes wide in disbelief. Another conductor stepped forward, holding a framed photograph and a tarnished brass plaque. The photo showed a much younger Franklin standing proudly in front of the restored station alongside city officials. The plaque, faded with age, read Franklin Aldridge, for saving Grand Central, a landmark reborn. McAllister continued, his voice trembling with quiet emotion. "Mr. Aldridge didn't just fight to preserve this building, he dedicated his life to it. After losing his wife and son in a car accident in 2015, he walked away from the spotlight. He turned down every award, every headline. Instead, he returned here not as an honored guest, but as a silent janitor, choosing to live among the people he once served, asking for nothing, seeking no recognition." He paused, bowing his head slightly toward Isabella. "And if not for you, Miss Carter, he might never have survived to see this day." Tears streamed freely down Isabella's cheeks, her bridal makeup long forgotten. She turned toward Franklin, her voice breaking. I had no idea." Franklin gave a small, bittersweet smile. "That was the point, dear," he whispered softly. "I didn't want anyone to thank me for a life I no longer felt worthy of. After I lost my family, I couldn't bear to be seen as anything but invisible." He swallowed hard, gathering his composure. "But you never asked who I was. You never demanded my story. You simply saw me, fed me, left me notes. Words that gave me just enough reason to show up again the next day. The conductors had now formed a solemn honor guard standing shoulder to shoulder along the aisle. McAllister addressed the guests once more. Ms. Carter never knew she was feeding a man who once stood as a guardian of this very place. She simply showed kindness to a fellow human being, day after day, year after year, without recognition or reward. His gaze swept across the guests, pausing on those who had whispered so carelessly before. In the railway, we have a saying, "No one walks these tracks alone," and today Ms. Carter reminds us all what that truly means. At that moment, Rachel, one of Isabella's bridesmaids, stepped forward, her voice trembling through tears. "I've seen her do it for years, always buying an extra coffee and bagel. I thought she was just soft-hearted. We teased her for it." Another coworker from the firm nodded, visibly ashamed. "We laughed at her, but we were wrong." One of the guests stood abruptly, voice thick with emotion. "We're not just witnessing a wedding," they declared. "We're witnessing a legacy being honored." Franklin gently took Isabella's trembling hands in his own, his voice breaking into something softer than a whisper. "I have nothing left to give, except my presence, my story, and my deepest gratitude. I heard you were getting married. I hope you don't mind. I contacted some old friends." Isabella smiled through her tears, pressing his hand to her heart. "You have no idea. This is the greatest gift I could have ever imagined." Ethan, who had stood quietly nearby, finally stepped forward. He extended his hand toward Franklin, his voice thick with admiration. "Sir, it would be an honor if you would walk her down the aisle." "Sir," Ethan whispered, emotion thick in his voice. "It would be the greatest honor if you would walk her down the aisle." Franklin paused for a long, breathless moment as though the weight of the offer had knocked the air from his chest. Then, with trembling hands, he nodded. "I would be honored." And so, with 12 conductors standing in solemn formation, Franklin Aldridge, once the silent janitor of Platform 27, walked Isabella Carter arm in arm toward the man she loved. After their honeymoon, Isabella didn't return to corporate law. Instead, she and Ethan took every dollar they had received in wedding gifts and opened a small breakfast station right inside Grand Central's lower level at the far corner near Platform 27. They called it the Morning Bench, marked only by a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Feed one life, save 1,000 stories." There were no photographers, no news articles, no press releases, just quiet service every morning for anyone who needed a warm meal without being asked their name or their story. Franklin never showed up at the Morning Bench after the wedding. But every month, Isabella received a single postcard from a different city somewhere across America, each one carrying the same handwritten line, "Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you, Isabella." Conductor McAllister had explained after the ceremony that Franklin had finally accepted help using his pension and benefits to receive proper medical care, trauma counseling, and housing. The Railway Brotherhood had taken it upon themselves to bring him back into the community he once saved. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Isabella and Ethan arrived early at the Morning Bench to find a familiar sight waiting for them. The 12 conductors, no longer in uniform, just dressed in their everyday clothes, stood quietly in line, each holding a single sunflower. "We'll be taking shifts here from now on," McAllister announced softly. "This honor, we won't let it fade." What had started as one woman's quiet act of kindness had grown into something far larger than she could have imagined. Word spread among the city's homeless and displaced. The Morning Bench became a sanctuary, a place where no one was asked for their backstory, their paperwork, or their worth. Isabella kept Franklin's original napkin framed above the coffee cart. It still read, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." And beneath it, she had added her own message, "Every soul who sits here carries a story worth remembering." 6 months later, a local reporter finally discovered the Morning Bench and begged for an interview. Isabella declined. "This isn't about me," she said simply. "It's about seeing the people the world pretends not to see." On the hardest mornings when donations ran low or volunteers didn't show up, Isabella would remember the moment 12 railwaymen had stood at attention in Vanderbilt Hall. Not for fame, not for spectacle, but for a simple bagel and coffee shared day after day. That memory was all she ever needed to keep going. Ethan, ever her quiet partner in kindness, understood completely. As a firefighter, he knew true heroism rarely came with applause. It came with consistency, showing up again and again when no one else would. One evening, as they locked up the coffee cart, Ethan leaned in with a grin. "When I married you," he whispered, "I didn't just get a wife. I got 12 conductors and a family I never knew I needed." Isabella laughed softly, her heart full. "The best kind of family," she replied. "The kind you choose, and the kind that chooses you back. So if you believe a simple meal can save a great soul type, I will live with kindness. Because some people live as heroes, only to die in silence if no one dares to see them as human beings. Some debts require no money to repay. Only the courage to look into someone's eyes and say, I see you. You matter. Isabella never needed to know Franklin's name to know he was worthy. Through her smallest action, a life was restored, and a city was reminded that not all heroes wear uniforms. Sometimes, the greatest protectors quietly wait beneath a flickering station light, holding nothing more than dignity and a fragile hope that someone, just someone, might one day look their way. Because the people we pass without a second glance, the janitors, the homeless, the forgotten, they may be the ones who once saved something far greater than we'll ever know. Live with kindness, not for the applause, not for the headlines, but for the quiet, unseen moments. So that one day when you least expect it, you might look up and see 12 people standing in silent tribute bowing their heads. For something you never imagined was worth celebrating. In a world addicted to viral fame and grand gestures, never forget this truth. Real heroism doesn't live in spotlights. It lives in the smallest, quietest acts of compassion offered again and again without an audience. New Day Story. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes finish their breakfast alone, waiting for someone brave enough to finally see them.